Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Tomasz Koper, sitting in for Divya Gopalan. In recent years, Taiwanese identity has been going through fundamental changes. With these came new links in politics, culture, and academia. The recognition of Taiwan as a focus of study separate from China is what we want to explore today. And to help us understand this emerging field of Taiwan studies, we have Dr. Isabelle Cockel from University of Portsmouth and Dr. Lev Nachman from the National Chengchi University in Taipei. Welcome to both of you. Isabelle, let me start with you. Besides being a researcher and a lecturer, you're also the Secretary General of the European Association of Taiwan Studies. Can you tell us a little bit about your organization and the state of Taiwan studies in Europe?
Yeah, thank you for having me on this show. The association was established in 2004, so this year we're very happily celebrating our 20th anniversary. So if I may have a bit of an advertisement, we're having our annual conference on 26th, 28th June at the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London. That is also where this association was established 20 years ago. So in 20 years, the more than 1,000 papers, half from humanities, half from social sciences, have been presented at our conferences in 20 years. And to this year, roughly 650 people have presented. I think it's a very healthy development. And that is also why we're so excited to celebrate our 20th anniversary.
Well, Lev, you are a political scientist that is focusing on political engagement in contested states. That's why you've been researching Taiwan for a number of years, both here and abroad. Can you tell us a little bit about how this field of Taiwan studies is developing here and elsewhere?
Yeah, so, it's important to keep in mind that people in Taiwan have been studying Taiwan for a very, very long time, which sounds obvious. So, when we talk about Taiwan studies, often we think of this kind of more of a global Taiwan studies and kind of more how Taiwan studies has become a field outside of Taiwan in places like Europe and North America. In North America, there's now decades of good scholarship coming from scholars who started coming to Taiwan as far back as the 60s and 70s. But really, the establishment of Taiwan studies programs has really just started to grow more and more in the last decade or two, where now there's more opportunities for graduate students, whether they're master's students or PhD students, or even undergrads, to start exploring the world of Taiwan studies more than ever before. And one of the challenges as a Taiwan specialist means trying to convince lots of people that Taiwan is an important place and that Taiwan can speak to audiences that might not necessarily think of Taiwan right away. And so in the United States, there's lots of other institutes beyond just Taiwan studies that care about Taiwan and Taiwan research, like places that study democracy or places that study peace and security are also very invested in sort of the growing field of Taiwan studies.
So, Isabelle, I'm curious about what kind of interest there is in Taiwan studies among students, among young people. I mean, most countries around the world have established departments of China studies that often attract a lot of students. Is there similar interest in Taiwan studies right now, or is it beginning to appear?
In the past, the experiences about Taiwan's development in the field of development studies, as Taiwan's been used as a very good case study for developmental state. Moving on from there, you also have the interest I mentioned just now, the democratization. Taiwan being seen as a very good example, actually being praised as the beacon of democracy in East Asia. So Taiwan is one of the examples of the third wave of democratization. No doubt security is always on people's mind, good or for the right reasons or not, whether Taiwan deserves the attention because it's a potential hotspot for military conflict, or because Taiwan offers a lot for us to understand the sovereignty, governance, human rights, or multiculturalism, or films, or literature, or indigenous people's culture. So I think there's a breadth of interest in Taiwan.
Well, this is a very comprehensive field. Like Isabelle said, there are a lot of fields, there are a lot of subcategories, and a lot of researchers are attracted to Taiwan studies. Lev, you studied one aspect of that, political science. If there were a Taiwan studies department when you were going to college, when you were picking your future, would you have majored in it?
That's a really good question. I think it definitely would have been on my radar, and I definitely would have wanted to at least investigate what that major looks like. But the biggest challenge that, a lot of Taiwan studies programs have, especially in the U.S., is a matter of funding. And this is really where debates about Taiwan studies as a separate institution start to really kick in. So the long story short is that in the United States, and likely largely in Europe, although I'm less familiar with Europe's context, there are long-established, well-funded centers for Chinese studies. Often Taiwan studies gets housed in these centers for Chinese studies. The benefit being they're well-funded and opportunities are pretty abundant in these programs. The downside being that there's a lot of topics within Taiwan, as we know, that don't really don't really fit the Center for Chinese Studies. The way that I usually describe it is that it's sort of like a Venn diagram where you have some topics that are definitely Taiwan studies and some topics that are definitely Chinese studies that don't necessarily go together. But then there's lots of overlap, and that's really the overlap that you kind of have to lean into when you go through a Chinese studies program. But of course, say, for example, if you're interested in say, democratization, it's not a very good topic if you're interested in China, but a very good topic if you're interested in Taiwan. Which has put a lot of Taiwan scholars in a very awkward position where we have to try to appeal to China study centers because they're often the ones with money. Now, the good news is that over the last decade or so, there's more and more Taiwan studies programs that are getting more and more funding, but it's still not necessarily enough to really be a meaningful home for lots of young scholars who are trying to get money to do research or get money to go abroad.
Long before Taiwan studies began emerging as a separate academic field abroad, there were voices calling for more focus on Taiwan here. Wang Pinghan is a postdoctoral researcher of Taiwanese literature at National Taiwan University. We asked her how her academic field got separated from Chinese literature. This is what she said.
We start this process from 1997, and it was Catholic University. It is a first one university for the Department of Taiwan Literature. But actually, Taiwanese have already asking for it since like 1970 and 1980s. So after the end of martial law, 1987, the democracy of Taiwan society is more and more open. So we finally can make people to understand that Taiwan has literature, and Taiwan literature need to be studied, and it's better in university than other place. Because actually in Chinese literature, there is no room for Taiwanese literature. Chinese literature is actually made by Chinese people and year by year. And also Taiwanese literature is by Taiwanese people, and we have a lot of different histories and accidents and events. So, and even different regimes. Like we have been ruled by the Qing dynasty, the Japanese, and we got people from Dutch, from I think it's Spanish, yeah.
Isabelle, tell me, how clear do you think this distinction between Chinese and Taiwanese literature has to be, especially when it comes to classics? Like, don't American students read Shakespeare after all?
I think what you referred to is perhaps a long history of so-called 乡土文学, the home soil literature. That has always been seen as a spiritual input to the growth of Taiwanese consciousness. And that, of course, is a very important driving force for Taiwanese identity growing, particularly after 1990s, with the support of democratization built on the confidence of Taiwanese economic development. And also, as she said just now, the Taiwanese literature in Taiwan, also as what Lev just said, mentioned just now, the the interest in Taiwan itself was suppressed in the island during the authoritarian era. So the growth of Taiwan studies in Taiwan is not necessarily the same as the Taiwan's interest in Taiwan outside of Taiwan. Taiwan studies as a field in Taiwan growing in the 1990s is more really in the wake of the rise of Taiwanese identity, whereas outside of Taiwan it's more as part of the area studies tradition. However, how we understand the Taiwanese literature, I think here a colleague mine here, I have to mention him, Professor Chris Berry at the King's College London, has tried to develop this idea of Sinophone sphere or Sinophone literature. Sinophone culture itself is a debatable concept. However, that is to try to see the people who use Chinese language broadly can use literature and can use most recently films or cinema or pop culture to express their identity, and then to also produce these incredible reach of cultural products for us to consume, to enjoy, and also identify with. So I think here we have to know how to understand the literature growing out of the Taiwanese soil that have a really specific and distinctive Taiwanese identity attached to that. But Chinese language itself is also versatile enough to encourage really great growth outside of these societies dominated by Han Chinese. So that's my take on the what you said just now.
Well, Wang Pinghan said that Taiwan has been contested for many centuries. Lev, this is more your field. Do you think that this contention, this coming and going of different rulers over Taiwan, has that resulted in other forms of academic uniqueness that are still somewhat part of this Sinosphere that Isabelle talked about outside of literature?
Yeah, so this goes into sort of a insider baseball of academia. The world of social science these days is focusing much less on area studies. So if you're in political science, sociology, it's much less popular to say that you are a regional specialist, that you specialize in a certain country or you specialize in a certain region. Instead, people want to hear much more about the actual sort of disciplinary expertise that you focus on, say things like political parties, social movements. And so, my own work, I self-describe as someone who studies contested states because I study places like Taiwan. And that's really sort of me trying to take what makes Taiwan interesting for me for my research and trying to think of a way to explain it in a way that makes sense to people in political science who might not necessarily think of Taiwan beyond just sort of this place that they might sometimes hear in the news. And what I do in my own work is try to think of ways to make Taiwan more generalizable and more interesting to more people around the world, because I think that's an important way that we can not just grow Taiwan studies, but make more people notice and care about Taiwan.
Wow, we should have you as one of the presenters on the show, because you've kind of hit the nail on the head with the entire premise of Connected. But I want to go back to what you mentioned before, both of you, in fact, the money. If there's one single problem that unites academics across the world, it's money. Many scholarly activities never take off the ground because of insufficient funding. James Lind is an assistant professor of Taiwan Studies at the University of Washington, and this is what he tweeted. Over half of the top 15 universities in North America have tenured or tenure-track Koreanists. Meanwhile, Taiwan Studies has one tenure-track job opening this year, the first in how many years? There should be no doubt that the Korea Foundation model is one that Taiwan should be looking to replicate. For those who aren't familiar, the Korea Foundation model supports setting up professorships and fellowship programs in universities across the world. So, Isabelle, how much money is going into Taiwan Studies right now?
Indeed, I think the government is smart in using government funding as a way of exercising the soft power to support Taiwan studies. But if you look at where the money comes from, in terms of the setting up programs or centers, or even just supporting teaching of Taiwan, then you have to think about whether it's going to be a degree course. So meaning that the institution who receives the money will be able to offer Taiwan studies as a degree, either as undergrad or postgrad. So this kind of money mostly comes from the Ministry of Education. You also have other non-governmental organizations that can provide funding, mostly for research. As individual scholars, you can also apply to the Taiwan Fellowship that is supported by the Ministry of Culture, that is to, in a sense, investing in individual scholars around the world to come to do research in Taiwan. But if you don't go through these channels, you can also try to collaborate with universities in Taiwan, getting their funding to support your research either individually or in a collaborative manner. But it has been argued by scholars in Europe particularly, the investment is not so reliable, and I shouldn't say investment, funding from the government is not so reliable, because you may get it, you may not get it. You may run for certain years and then it will cease to fund your activities. But back to what James said just now about professorship, that is a very long-term investment that is still lacking, I would say, because support the scholars from undergrad, postgrad to PhD, and from PhD onward to do postdoc, and then further to become a fully developed scholar takes a long time.
Well, Lev, it is a long-term commitment, and it is definitely a complex field when it comes to financing these kind of positions. But with so many tenured or tenure-track positions, how can Taiwan studies attract professors, future professors? Is the attraction of the field itself enough, even if funding is so complicated to obtain?
Yeah, it's not enough. Like, what we have right now is just simply not enough. The Korean Foundation serves as an excellent model to show how Taiwan studies is currently not doing as well as it should be. I think you can talk to most people who try to set up these Taiwan studies institutes or programs around the world, and you'll hear that they have a lot of frustrations with the bureaucratic bloat and the inconsistent support from certain funders over the years. And it's very difficult to try to think about the future of Taiwan studies knowing that we just sort of trail behind when it comes to these programs like the Korean Foundation. The Taiwanese government has known that the Korean Foundation has been so successful for so long, and I think there's a lot of people that have been hoping that the Ministry of Education would be more enthusiastic to copy their model quicker than it has been. But there are still important steps being made, and there are people within the Ministry of Education and different bureaucracies within Taiwan that are trying to catch up. And I must say a major shout out to Professor James Lin at the University of Washington, whose tweet you read. He has been doing absolutely so much for the world of Taiwan studies in North America. More than I think I will ever be able to accomplish in my lifetime. So we owe a great debt for the growth of Taiwan studies in the United States to James.
I want to go back to younger people, less established sinologists, many of whom come to Taiwan with a background in sinology or Chinese studies, which often comes with certain preconceptions. And I would know because I was one of them. We asked a group of scholars and professionals in Taipei with a similar background about their own journeys and opinions on Taiwan studies. Take a look.
So, given our academic backgrounds, what was everyone's impression of Taiwan before they came here?
I did not have Taiwan on my radar at all because, my department was entirely older. Professors were from China. I started hearing about Taiwan from a group of Taiwanese exchange students that came to our university.
When I started studying at Warsaw University, I felt like the general, I hesitate to say narrative, but that was what most of people were kind of thinking of Taiwan is that, it is just like a smaller China. Only after spending 6 weeks here and loving it, I realized a lot of things. So
a lot of differences.
Yeah. That it's basically like two entirely separate entities. Yeah.
My school actually requires students to study abroad, and they only had programs in China. Literally just Taiwan never came up as a thought, and I didn't know to even think about it.
Before I came here to Taiwan, I thought there is only two sides. And when I came to Taiwan, I saw it's a lot more complex than that. So there's, in Taiwan, there's actually people who consider themselves Chinese. There's people who consider themselves not Chinese, Taiwanese, who have a Taiwanese identity. There's Aboriginal culture. There's Hakka, lots. And so when you finally come here, you gradually learn about these things.
The most I've noticed about Taiwanese people is the generational gap in beliefs and understanding. And yeah, that's not something you can really realize unless you're here.
So I was wondering, does Taiwan need a separate field of studies, like China studies, for itself? Maybe Taiwan studies, because it's a separate entity in itself.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. It has its own history, its own language. You know, Taiyu has its own culture and cinema and all these things. So I think it makes sense for it to have its own separate department.
Taiwanese academic field is already doing a very good job. They come by various names. I know that for NTNU it's Taiwan Studies Department. For NTU it's Taiwan Literature and Languages Department, I guess. But it's just like basically they operate within the same academic field, yeah. We're already talking about the cultural diversity in Taiwan, that you have, it's kind of like composed. It was molded by so many different influences that I think that it totally deserves to have its own discipline that goes without saying, at least for me.
So, Lev, one of the sentiments that a few of them expressed in this video was that Chinese studies programs often focus on language and training translators. How can Taiwan studies be more than that?
I think it's a matter of trying to, again, think of ways that Taiwan speaks to lots of different parts of the world. Obviously, there's so much about Taiwan that is very special about Taiwan, like Taiwan's indigenous histories, like Taiwan's complex colonialisms over the years. But in order for Taiwan to really grow, I think it's a matter of learning to frame what makes Taiwan special, but also comparable to other parts of the world in order to attract students from all over the world to really take note about Taiwan, and really finding ways to make Taiwan studies appeal to people from all different backgrounds, from all different nations.
And Isabelle, a point that both Bartek and Dee made in that video is that they didn't even have Taiwan on their radars because most of their professors were from China. How big of an issue is that?
It is a big issue, of course, because if people do not even know where it is, then will not have any cultural exposure to that. Apart from bubble tea, then it is a challenge. So I think if we can go back to the issue of funding, then it will be useful for more exchange programs established between the institutions abroad and also Taiwanese institutions. There's I don't think it's a secret that you really need to allure people to come to visit Taiwan to find out the richness that this small island can offer, and then to understand how the diversity of this Chinese-speaking culture. The language itself is important because it attracts, particularly for the language students, they attract them to spend a good amount of time, maybe 3 months as one term or a year, as a year abroad students, to really understand it, not as a tourist, but to have meaningful interactions with the people about the culture.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time in this episode. I would like one final question, if I may, to Lev, very briefly. Ultimately, how do Taiwanese people benefit from having Taiwan studies? How does my Taiwanese wife and my neighbor, What do they get out of this?
I think one of the most important things, speaking broadly about Taiwan's situation today, that Taiwan needs to do is to find ways to create allies and supporters around the world. And the most important way for Taiwan to do that is to really bring Taiwan to the world. And the world of academia is one of the prime ways in which 18-year-old students around the world start to learn about things that they wouldn't have really known about outside their own sort of initial environments. And one of the ways that Taiwan Studies helps with that cause is by teaching people about Taiwan in a way that they would never have really interacted with it in the past. So the way that Taiwanese people here benefit from Taiwan is that's really the best way that we can really share Taiwan in a way that isn't just about flashpoints, isn't just about the dire headlines you read in the newspaper, but actually introducing Taiwan in a way that's I think far more meaningful and deeper and can start to create these sort of lifelong connections to this country.
Well, that is unfortunately all the time we have for this episode of Connected. Thank you to Dr. Isabelle Cockel and Dr. Lev Nachman in Taipei for this brief seminar on the emerging academic field of Taiwan studies. And to our audience at home, it was great to have your company. Thank you and stay connected.